Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Business of Fun podcast. This is me, Dave Wakeman. I am your host. First thing today, I want to mention that I have a really great guest by the name of Ruth Hartt. And if you are anywhere around arts and entertainment and tickets and arts marketing, you have probably seen Ruth's post. Maybe you've even seen the commercial she created from pulling together bits and pieces around the internet. She works with a tool from the Clayton Christensen Institute called Jobs to be Done. This was a really great conversation. I think we really are aligned on this thing. So Ruth is awesome. Before we get to Ruth, though, I want to tell you I am planning the world's first podcast-based conference called a Podference. Hannah Graneman, who was the last guest on the podcast, shared this idea with me, and I was like, oh, we should do this thing. It'll sound like fun. So I've taken this on. We're going to try to do it for like the last week of April. Each day we're going to put out a few different podcast panels, podcast episodes, so all focused around the theme of recovery. So there is a link in the podcast show notes, or you can send me an email, dave@davewakeman.com. I will get it to you. I want to make sure that I get you the information, the people, the ideas you need to make this thing successful. I think it's going to be fun. I think it'll be great. And I'm going to figure out how to do this thing because why the hell not? We haven't had a lot of fun things to always look forward to over the last 2 years. So this is going to be awesome. So Podference is what it's called. Check out, if you haven't already, an old friend of the podcast, Corey Left, who does the John Wall Street newsletter, has a really cool story coming up with me and Simon Mabb about refund protection. And this just goes on to highlight some of the really interesting things about refund protection and recovery from the pandemic, including the increase in rate of uptake by customers, the usefulness of it, what to look for, what not to look for in a good or bad refund protection provider. It's all there. Check out Sportico to get the John Wall Street newsletter. I'll share the link to the story when it's live. And check out Booking Protect so you can find out how to offer your guests a better refund protection experience. Now, the rates of refund uptake have probably doubled. That means that where people were taking 10 or 15% before, now they're taking up 20 to 30%. And that just is a clear sign that people are still uncertain about the virus. They want a little bit more security, a little bit of peace of mind in their purchases. So check out bookingprotect.com. Also, make sure that you get the Talking Tickets newsletter. Each week, Talking Tickets, 5 stories. Well, actually, it's a little different now, but you get 4 stories and some links and blurbs and little quick hits from me. TalkingTickets.substack.com. It's the first place usually where you find out stuff that's going on in the Slack channel, which you can get as well. Any webinars, classes, appearances, talks, anything I'm doing, because this year I want to make sure that I'm always focused on recovery, strategy, marketing, and branding. So TalkingTickets.substack.com. Now back to Ruth. Ruth Hartt is with the Clayton Christensen Institute, and she is a former opera singer. So she did this really great commercial on LinkedIn. I thought it was amazing. I shared it in the Talking Tickets newsletter. I emailed her. I said, I think that what you're doing is awesome. Would you come on the podcast? And she did, which was great because I was like, what kind of glutton for punishment is she that she would come and do this? But we talk about Clayton Christensen and the business theory called Jobs to be Done. We talk about how that leads you to be more innovative, more customer focused, and how the idea, while popularly applied to social issues or the world of business, is just as valuable in the world of arts and arts marketing. And for me, it's just as relevant in sports and concerts, theater, everywhere. We talk about the decline of arts audiences. We talked about the need to be more customer-centric. We talk about how to get out of your own head when you're thinking about your customers. We talk about, you aren't your customer, which is definitely an idea that comes up with me all the time. We talk about demographics. We talk about economic status. We talk about competition. We talk about choices, data, millennials, customer behavior, social issues. Like I mentioned at the start, we talk about the Sydney Opera, intention to action. We even talk about Aubrey Bergauer and who was on the podcast before the pandemic started, and some of the stuff she's doing. I mean, we hit a lot. So, it's really about the importance of talking to real live people. It's really about the importance of doing the proper work of marketing, and it's really about understanding what's going to give you a chance to be successful or not coming out of the pandemic. So this is a great check out this conversation between me and Ruth Hartt.
All right, we should be recording now. I want to welcome Ruth Hartt to the Business Fun podcast. Ruth, thank you so much for doing this. I have been tracking you down for weeks now. I've been like, you have to come on this thing. You have to allow me to share your ideas with everybody. So thank you for coming.
Dave, thanks so much. It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. I don't necessarily always try to schedule people that I seem to agree with most things on, but it seems to happen. So welcome.
Awesome.
Actually, you have so all kidding aside, though, you have a really, really great and keen point of view that the first time I saw your post on LinkedIn, I believe it was an ad that you created using stock footage. And, you did which sounds a lot like what I do here, the very most basic tools to create what you considered a more customer-focused ad for an arts organization. And I thought it was great because most of the time I beat on people and I talk to in sports and concerts and theater, the whole deal about stop navel gazing. Mm-hmm. And it seemed that you were going, look, stop navel gazing. But, how'd you come up with this idea to create an ad, your own ad campaign for arts organization?
Well, let me start with a tiny bit of background, which will help you understand my perspective. So I actually come from the arts world. I was an opera singer and a music educator for many years. And when I finally decided it was time to get a job that actually paid the bills, I landed at the Clayton Christensen Institute. And Clayton Christensen was a Harvard Business School professor, writer of many best-selling books, and a developer of business theory. And his ideas really transformed the landscape of the business sector. It really changed how people thought about innovation and about the customer. And at the Institute, what we're doing is we're taking these business theories and we're actually applying them to social issues. So we're trying to transform education and healthcare and poverty. And so as I became familiar with these ideas, it started to dawn on me, hang on, we've got a problem in the arts sector and the problem of this decline of our audiences. And, maybe these ideas can help. So I started, reading and researching and writing about this. And it just became so clear to me that this idea of customer centricity was really integral to the change that we need to make in the arts sector. National Endowment for the Arts tells us that audiences have declined for classical music by about 50% in the last 2 decades. That's huge, and there's millions of dollars that have been spent researching best practices in audience development, but we're not really seeing declines. We're not really seeing this decline reverse. Mm-hmm. I lost you for a second there.
Yeah, for about 15 seconds there. Okay, so you were talking about the 50% decline in audience and that we aren't seeing, despite all this money that the National Endowments of the Arts is investing, we aren't seeing any change.
Yes. Yeah.
And see, this is what I always avoid is having to edit. Now I got to edit.
Oh, man. Well, I'll start right around that spot and hopefully.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Oh, yeah. Don't worry about it. I was just going, damn it, I'm going to have to edit. Okay.
Yes, I think what's really missing from this conversation is, the real live customer. And the arts sector doesn't like to use that term. We don't like to call our audiences our customers, but here's what the business sector knows. They know that consumers buy products or services, or let's say concert tickets, not because of who they are, but because of who they want to become. So in other words, they're not paying for the product, they're actually paying for the outcome that they're seeking. And this is what we call jobs to be done theory. This is one of the theories that Clayton Christensen was integral in really putting forward in the business sector. And what this tells us is that, all this demographic data that we're, sorting through to try to understand our audiences, it's really not that useful. I know, blasphemous, right? What's actually more important is these real live customer stories, because when you dig into them, when you really sit down with a customer, you're going to find that they're not buying tickets just to hear beautiful orchestral music, right? They're not buying tickets just to see, historic works of art. There are other motivations that drive their purchasing decisions. And this is, one of my favorite quotes from Clayton Christensen. He says, unless you understand the full context in which your customers are making a choice to hire your product or service, you will be unlikely to create the right offering for them. You'll just be treading water with them until they fire your product and hire one that understands them better. So that's where I got my, the name of my blog, Culture for Hire, right? So I think, understanding all these latent motivations, it's really a game changer for audience development, because you instantly have a whole different perspective on how to frame your marketing and your strategy. It's really, I think, a seismic shift. And you realize customers don't care how amazing a product is or how amazing its purveyors are. All they really want to know deep down inside is, how can this product transform me? How can it help me meet my goals in life? How can it help me become who I want to be? So you're turning that camera lens around from your organization, from that really traditional egocentric approach to your target audiences, to the people in your community, to that, to the customer centric approach. And so that ad that I pulled together of the stay-at-home mom, ending up at the symphony, escaping to the symphony, that was all based on these ideas.
So, all right, I'm going to ask a couple of really ridiculous questions that I already know the answers to, but that seems to be just where I'm at these days. So this applies to everybody, right? Like, just the idea of jobs to be done and customer not caring necessarily about what they're buying. It's about the job to be done. It would apply to concerts, right? And it would apply to sports, right? And it would apply to theater and and it would apply to museums, and it would apply to, where won't it apply?
Oh, it applies to everything. Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
It applies to, where you choose to work, right? What organization you choose to work for. It applies to marriage and who you choose to marry, and what they're looking for in a house. I mean, it really, it applies to parenting. It across the board.
It's true. I did that to be ridiculous, because this whole idea has been, I have been talking about it constantly now for years, and I use a different term for it, but it's called being market oriented.
Yes.
But it's the same thing. It's like, I think we were talking about earlier in the week when we were scheduling this about doing the flip, and we use the same language, and everything. It's a little, but you have to. The challenge that I see a lot, and I'm curious about the way you do, and I think I believe I described it to you. So again, this is like one of those things where I'm like, feel like I'm seeding the podcast with somebody who's going to agree with every idea that I'm going to throw out there, and that may be true. It's always like it's always an executive that and it's always a guy that like loosens his tie and goes, hey, I'm going to tell you exactly what the customer wants. Right. And I want you to describe to me how dangerous that is, because they've heard it from me. These people have heard it from me a million times if they've heard it once. Yeah. Will you explain why that's so dangerous?
Well, here's what we're seeing in traditional arts marketing, right? So the photos on the website, all you're seeing are the conductor, the guest artists, the musicians, the composers. The language that's being used is just, this elevated, descriptive, flowery language. All the copy centers around, how, virtuosic the artists are, the organization's achievements, how beautiful, how powerful the repertoire is. It's just not relevant to people in our communities. That's not their world. We as our artists and arts administrators, we've been steeped in this world for decades, but the uninitiated, the outsiders that Nina Simon talks about, they have no context whatsoever. They don't care about our glowing bios. They want to hear their language. They want to see familiar imagery. That's what's going to draw them in. They want to know, how is this going to transform my life? Is it worth the cost, the effort? Am I going to fit in there? Do my values align? There's so many questions that they're asking every day as they're making choices. And if you're not answering these questions up front, you're wasting your time.
Yeah. Now, there was another point that you made in the first answer about the demographics and about how demographic information is mostly useless.
Mm-hmm.
In my newsletter, I often use there's a photo an ad agency I think in London created it. I don't remember where. I can't properly attribute it just now, but it shows Prince Charles and Ozzy Osbourne side by side, and they have like all their demographic information is exactly the same.
Yes.
For a podcast guest from a few episodes ago, a few months back, Zoe Skaman, I think it was Zoe, said this to me. She goes, if you are segmenting your market based on demographics, it's like picking who you're going to target based on astrology. And I was like, well, that's awesome.
Great.
So now, when you look at this, right, and you think about demographics versus I teach people behavioral segmentation. Again, this is like, I feel like I'm being a jerk when I'm asking these questions, because the answer is like obvious when we're talking. It's how do you teach people to look at this? Because, and I guess I'll frame the question a little bit differently so I don't sound like a jerk, because aren't people, if you're looking at just demographics, you are leaving so many opportunities to engage a new or different audience on the table? Or am I completely pulling stuff out of thin air?
You absolutely are, because Clay Christians always like to say we're getting the categories wrong, right? The category is not, economic status or, age or whatever. It's what's the job to be done, right? Mm-hmm. So a job to be done is solution agnostic, which means it can be solved by many, many different things. So what that means is competition for arts organizations isn't just other arts organizations.
Right.
Competition is sporting events, restaurants, Netflix, a glass of wine, whatever the job is, and however the customers are solving that job, that's what the category is. And when you start to think about it that way, the market expands dramatically, right? Because somebody who's using Netflix as a solution in their life could potentially be convinced to use an orchestral concert. It's all in how you understand their emotional and social context and how you reach out to them based on those concepts.
So let me ask you this then. Are most of the time when you're dealing with you're dealing with the arts most of the time. Well, I guess with working at the Clayton Christensen Institute, you work with across the board. This is something I've always kind of noticed about people. They don't always understand who their competition is, right? Mm-hmm. All the time. They do a very poor job of defining who their competitive set is. And to me, it sounds like if you look at it through the lens of jobs to be done, it changes that competitive set too, because the thing is like, instead of saying, well, because like you said, glass of wine, sporting event, a lot of times your competition is not doing anything at all, mm-hmm. right? It's like, you have to fight inertia, right? Like, mm-hmm. I want to do something cultural, but it just seems so hard. And, so how do you deal with that? Like helping people understand how to redefine their competition? Because I think that really, at least in my experience, it helps people a lot, right? Because if you can show them like, hey, look, this is really your competition. You're like fighting the laundry that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. How do you do that? How do you walk people through that?
Yeah, it's amazing how the world is so full of choices now, right? I mean, there are so many options for people, and it can be paralyzing, I think, to pick sometimes. But I think it really comes down to thinking about who are our audiences? Who are the people in our community, and what are their needs? What are their wishes? What are their problems they're trying to solve? And it really, you can do a general guesstimate. I like to talk about, the businessman whose boss is coming into town, and he wants to, show him a good time and impress him. So he hires. What does he hire to help him with that? He could hire the orchestra. He could hire a number of different things. Or the romantic guy who wants to impress his sophisticated date, and what are his options? When you start to really narrow down into a real customer and what their situation is, that's when you can start to understand what their choices are, what their competition is, and how to really engage them.
And I'm gonna ask a question. I think that maybe know the answer to too. When you dig down like this, right? And this will be. I'm curious about this from your point of view, because most of the time, what I find is that people lock themselves into these mindsets where they can only do a certain things a certain way in a certain manner. If you are smart about the way you approach this thing, using jobs to be done theory, or just calling it market orientation, I think they all mean something very similar. You can also end up finding out that you can charge people more. You can make more money, which should be a prime idea too, because if you can't fund your mission, you can't keep going on, which I think is always, like you talk about, like arts doesn't want to talk about customers. They think the financial side is bad. Ruth and I are here to tell you the financial side is good. It gives us the money to keep going. It's great.
Yes.
But is that what you see, or is that something that you are able to convince people of, or is that still something people are reluctant to look at?
Well, it's absolutely true, and it's true in any industry. I wrote a piece recently about Spirit Airlines, and I don't know if you're familiar with Spirit Airlines, but everyone hates Spirit Airlines. No one has good things to say about it. But guess what? Their net profits averaged around $285 million a year from 2014 to 2019, consistently well above industry average. Okay, why is that? It's because you find the answer in a real customer story. There are consumers out there, many of them, who they're making trade-offs based on what they value most, right? So whether it's price or convenience or time of day, one trade-off always trumps another. And so for Spirit Airlines, these customers are willing to trade a bad flying experience for dirt cheap tickets. And so, no, I'm not going to promote, selling arts tickets for dirt cheap. What I'm saying is that, we got to find out what our audiences are prioritizing. So if they're young parents, they might prioritize a concert that is happening midday, and is featuring content that's targeting children. And they might be willing to pay more. In fact, this has been proven to be true, that they're willing to pay more for those types of concerts. Maybe their job to be done is not having to entertain their children for an hour and a half. So you need to figure out who are the people in our audiences, what do they prioritize, and you got to provide those options, those trade-offs, and then you can price accordingly.
You're saying, so my credit card statements from the 2011, 2012, 2013 timeframe, when there was like lots and lots of Yo Gabba Gabba, and I forget the other one, is totally right.
Absolutely.
Absolutely normal. But what it sounds like, though, when in Ryanair, so like if Spirit Airlines doesn't hit anybody, Ryanair is the same deal, right? In Europe, they also make boatloads of money. I think their perception by their market is a little bit better than Spirit Air's. Like Spirit Air is has a little bit worse reputation, but it's the same deal, and they make way more money than any other airline, it seems like, because of the trade-off. People are willing to make those trade-offs. And so I want to ask you then, like, because this price thing, right? And I guess how I'll frame it is, I hear a lot of times people talk about the price of theater, or the price of art or opera or whatever it is, and they go, well, people just won't pay for that, and they just don't perceive, they just won't put the value in it. They just don't, and I'll go, of course, people won't pay for anything that they don't find the value in, right? And that's just a job of marketing, right? If you just think the market is going to wave its magic arms and it's going to out of thin air create an audience for you, then either A, you're saying that marketing and sales is worthless, which
Mhm.
I've got a whole career full of projects that probably says you're wrong, and B, that like there's nothing you can do, which I've also got a whole career worth of stuff that can do wrong. So this make like the actual process of like surveying and doing research on your audience that much more important, so that you can understand like out of the people who are already there, like why they're really coming, right? As opposed to just assuming they're coming because, oh, the
Mhm.
Nutcracker is this magical thing, right? Which the Nutcracker is amazing. So don't kid, the Rockettes are awesome,
Mhm.
but they're not coming because they can't not they have to see the Nutcracker or the Rockettes every year. They're coming for something else. And
Mhm.
I talk about research all the time. So doesn't this make that process like so much more important?
I really think it does. I think there's a lot of assumptions that arts organizations are making and have been making for many, many years. You know, they assume that their target audiences want to hear them talk about themselves, but in fact, the opposite is true, right? And they assume that their patrons should love their art as much as they do. But it's not always about the art, and this is, you know, heart wrenching for artists to hear. But it's true, you know. The customers are buying tickets, you know, for the simple fact that maybe they want to buy their elderly mother a unique birthday present, you know,
Mhm.
or someone's lonely and they're new to the area and they want to get to know, they want to get connected to the community.
Mhm.
There's so many of these stories out there that are shared by many, many people. They're not just one-offs, right? And when you start to dig down and understand these stories, you can really start to change your strategy and your marketing, and shape it around these needs, these customer needs.
Yeah. And it goes back to like where we kind of started here. Even it's like if you stop segmenting your audience based on demographics. So if you get out of the astrology business and get into the business of marketing, you're going to segment your audience based on behavior, which is what I teach people to do.
Mhm.
And I have a really great, it's sitting here, I can't wave it around because I don't want anybody to see it, but a really great customer segmentation, and it's named by people like, and one of them, because it's like so appropriate for the when we're recording this just before Christmas, is the Clark Griswold. And they're like, so it's a family man, like, you know, this is the family thing, and they're doing the thing. But it draws a distinct picture, and the
Mhm.
way you're going to sell to Clark Griswold
Mhm.
is much different than the way you're going to sell to, let's say, Ozzy Osbourne, right, or Prince Charles. And
Mhm.
it's amazing to me that people don't take that they're so reluctant to take this step back and look at the market the way it is, as the way they want it to be. So like my question to you on this is, you know, how do you have that conversation? Because most people are so set in their ways on, this, like, it has to be this way because it's always been this way.
Mhm.
Things never change. Like, this is our thing, and like we're just going to set ourselves up and sell ourselves down the road to eventual destruction of our industry, because the people who will always love the arts are the only people who will love the arts.
Yes.
And an example too, to give you a chance to formulate your answer. I grew up in northern Georgia, in the middle of nowhere. We're going to go there tomorrow. Even there's like maybe 5,000. I had no idea what a opera was, a theater, I had no idea what a Broadway was until, and here I am, like, I've sold hundreds of millions of dollars in tickets to like all this stuff over the years. And I will go to like see the theater, the arts, the concerts, any of this stuff every chance I get. But if you looked at me just by demographic data, you'd say like Dave is completely not my audience, and you'd be missing out on, like, I don't know how much money I spend on arts, but it's a lot. So, but how do you get people off of that thing to understand that, like, the market's always moving, people are always changing,
Mhm.
change is constant. The way we do things is not always the right way to keep doing things.
I mean, you just look at the data, really. You look at the data that comes out from the National Endowment of the Arts every couple of years around, you know, how many people are attending classical music, and it's declined precipitously over the past 2 decades. And it's kind of terrifying when you think about, where are we going to be in 20 years when these, you know, 60, 70, 80-year-olds that are going now are aging out, where are we going to be? Something has to give,
We almost need the video of this one because we like our.
It really is scary. And I think there's, our target audiences now are, the millennials, and the millennials are so entirely different from the previous generation. They're more diverse. They have a different understanding or a broader definition of what constitutes culture. So there's so many things you need to understand about that demographic as well. They prefer interactive experiences. But then, I just sit people down and I say, okay, let's just watch some commercials from the business sector, from the for-profit sector, because they've got it. I mean, for the most part, not all organizations have this customer-centric focus, but a lot of them do, especially the Fortune 500 companies. And it's all about the customer. They barely even mention the organization or the product, right? And it's telling stories. And I think when you see those side by side, where you sit down and you watch an orchestra ad and then you watch, like a Nike commercial, it hits you in the face. This is so entirely different. We really need to make this change.
Yeah. Oh no, and to highlight this idea too of the millennials, and again, we are playing in the world of astrology a little bit by talking about this, but it does bring up a good point, because when I went to Australia at the end of 2019 to give a talk in Sydney at this conference, I queried countless arts organizations around Australia and New Zealand, even like Singapore and China. Who knew that all these people would come see me? It was great. But one of the key things that they came back to me was like, we want to hear about how to overcome this idea that seems to be pervasive, which is that and to fight back against this idea that older and whiter will continue to work forever. And I was like, yeah, that probably doesn't sound very good. And I was like, then it's like a middle-aged white guy they asked to explain how older and whiter is. I was like, that's a reach, but I'm here for you. But it highlights this thing. It's like, what work got you this far, but what's going to get you to the next stage of, your organization's life cycle, whatever, might not necessarily be the same thing. And you have to kind of be really willing, like you said, to look at organizations that are outside of your industry, because just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean it's right.
Right.
Because if the whole industry is losing people, then that shouldn't be like, well, if everybody else is doing it, I'm fine. No, I know that happens. Mm-hmm. It should be like, well, who's doing stuff that's well? And, you talked about Nike. The Van Gogh, the interactive Van Gogh exhibit that's kind of touring the world right now is a really good example of finding a way to, people want to experience the art. They want to do it in a different way. It's a job to be done. And they're making tons and tons of money, because I know the people, they do it. And it's like everywhere I see one, there's lines. Like Miami, I was there, DC, there's huge. It's great. I mean, the question, there's so many questions, Ruth. There's always questions.
I
how do you fight that resistance? Because I know that, and I guess I've asked this question a couple different ways, is how do we get people comfortable with going, hey, look, this thing works for me here. And just because I'm not seeing it somewhere else in the arts, I can use it, right? Because that seems to be a big challenge. And it's in the arts, and it's definitely in sports, right? Like I can only do I can only benchmark myself against my sector, like the people in my sector. And I'm like, well, you shouldn't be benchmarking yourself, because this is world-class stuff. This is once in a lifetime experiences. These things, they only happen once, right? Because you're never going to have that same cast with that same audience in that same place at the same time ever again.
Yeah.
It's always a once in a lifetime experience. I mean, maybe I'm just a good marketer. I don't know, but it seems obvious to me. But
yeah,
I need to steal from you, because you can give me some ideas on how to topple this.
Well, I think also that we have to look at consumer behavior too, because I think it's changed so dramatically with social media and, Yelp reviews and Google business reviews and all of that. The power now is held by the consumer, and people are making their choices very differently these days, right? They hate marketing. Everyone's blocking marketing. Everyone is not watching ads anymore. But what they're doing is they're getting recommendations from family and friends, right? So part of this shift is finding out how to create that word of mouth, that organic word of mouth, the free marketing engine. And I think one of the other things that's super important to recognize is that consumers are now making choices based on values. And it's a really big shift, but it's super important. It's very tied to the millennial mindset. Millennials are, I think 68% of millennials are say that they are actively working to create change in the world. And so a lot of consumers these days are trying brands because they know that their values aligned with the brand's values. And I think that's another issue that arts organizations need to dive into is what are our values and how are we communicating them and how are we actually demonstrating them in action? Because I think that's another way to change that approach to really start to think about the new way that consumers are making choices.
Yeah, this thing about values, right? And being, like what brand purpose, right? Like that, this thing. I'll be honest with you because we've been, we've agreed on most things. The data had before the pandemic. Again, this is like something I think that we don't know the answer for right now. So but it was like most of the time you'd ask the people the question and they would say, "Oh yeah, of course, I buy stuff made on depending on like what I feel." And most of the time we found out by looking at the actual purchase data, it was bullshit. And like most of the time, at best, it was a tiebreaker. What I am curious though is that like now, what impact the pandemic will have on this, and this is like actually it opens up a good question, which is like, how do you do research right now, and how do you understand, like, make sense of the data? Because really, the world is different now than it was 2 years ago, and some of these like things that like maybe brand purpose was completely bogus, which would be the way I saw the data beforehand, but maybe now it isn't, because I see in the data that I look at and some, in the behavioral data, especially, people have changed, right? They have changed like what they're willing to invest in. They've changed what they want to do. They change how they look at their, look at value, all these things that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. I guess the question is like, how do you, what is data that's relevant now? And then like, how do you do research in an environment like this where I don't think there is any certainty?
Yeah. I like to always think about it in terms of that job to be done theory, right? So your job is to find out, are there social issues that your customers are really deeply concerned about? Mm-hmm. And they feel a desire to make a difference, to make a change in those social issues. And if so, how can we as an organization help them do that? How can we help our target audiences feel like they're having an impact on some of these social issues? So you're seeing a lot of arts organizations now trying to program more, more music written by diverse composers. You're seeing some arts organizations, bring their music to folks that originally, previously had no access to it. So I think it's looking at, sitting down with your audiences and finding out what social issues are really important to you and what are some of the ways that we can help you feel like you're having an impact as you engage with our art. So it's using our art as a medium to help these audiences feel like they're really, having an impact, creating change.
Yeah. And I like, and the thing is like, and I warned you before we were doing this, that like, so at some points I will play the bad guy, and I will be the one who does this. Well, and I think that was like a sign of it too, because I'm not as harsh on that stuff as I like probably want to make myself out to be. And it's like after Pearl Jam did the tour where they partnered with UPS and like to lessen their carbon footprint, I started to pay a lot more attention to my, my carbon footprint, right? You got an electric car, look for solar panels on the house. I mean, I'm a full-fledged tree hugger at this point. And I've seen organizations, right? The Sydney Opera does a great job, or that's actually Opera Australia, I should be like, to be specific. They do a great job of making sure that the opera gets out into the communities around Sydney. They go to Parramatta, they go all over the place, but my challenge still becomes, it's like, I do think representation matters because I know a lot of people who come from multicultural, like multiracial backgrounds. So, um, and I guess like it sounds to me like the challenge is like people are all you're never going to defeat this idea that like people are going to tell you a little bit. There's bias, there's confirmation bias. If I ask you a question like, "Hey, Ruth, do you want to hear some art from like more diverse audiences?" You're not going to say no to me because you're going to be like, "Going, I would sound like a jerk." Um, but at the same time, if you look at the purchase data and like the behavioral aspects of it, you still see a little reluctance. Is there a good way to bridge that gap, like from intention to action? If that makes sense, if I didn't ask a really ridiculous question.
I think part of this is bringing in outsiders to get their perspective. You need to make sure that you're not just programming something in a performative way, but you're bringing in outsiders. I think having a community advisory board that is very, very diverse is a huge asset to any organization. I wrote a piece recently about how I walked into a lumber yard for the first time ever, and I had never. I was really surprised to find myself very nervous. I had no idea like where to go, who to talk to, what I was even there for, what I was looking for. And it was a very stressful experience. And I got home and I was like, oh, that's what, our outsiders feel like when they're attending an orchestra concert. It's really stressful.
Yeah.
And having an advisory board come in and help you, really pinpoint some of these things that can change, I think is really important for an organization, bringing in that outsider perspective.
Yeah, it moves beyond, and when I do a lot of brand work these days, and so one of the big things I look at when I'm talking about brand and like what your brand is, the brand associations, I want to go to the loyalist, right? Mm-hmm. So I want to talk to the people who really, really love you. At the same time, I know that you have to get beyond that because if you just talk to the people who love you, you're going to get an incredibly non-representative sample of your audience. Yes. And it's super important that people look beyond just the people who love them because that's going to be limited. And like getting these diverse voices, it's so incredible. And in your work, right? Because I think you spend a lot of time doing research, in all these really, really great areas. Mm-hmm. Again, this is like something I rattle these ideas off, but I want to ask you about this. How are you doing that kind of research? How do you go, teach people to go out and get diversity? Like, what, do you use like a panel company? Do you recruit widely? Because I know for a lot of arts organizations, if you talk about diversity and going out and get a diverse audience, there's that big decline that we talked about. Mm-hmm. So then they're going to go, well, how do I go and get a diverse audience when I can't get it anyway to be my advisory?
It's actually a huge issue. It's really difficult because, you're not getting a lot of new buyers. You're not, or audiences. You're not getting a lot of diverse audiences. So it's a huge issue. I love the story of Nintendo, how they, in the early 2000s, they decided to, they wanted to design a product that was more accessible and to their, what we call non-consumers. And so what they did is they found a bunch of people who hated playing video games. And, some of the themes that emerged were that, their haters found that most games were too complicated and most controllers were too difficult to maneuver. And so they launched the Wii. We all know how successful that was. That product, changed the industry, right? And it came from, I think but in 4 years, they had sold 67 million units, I think is the number. But it completely changed the industry. And it came from conversations with haters, right? People who did not like playing video games. So it's such an important conversation to have. I think Aubrey Bergauer was really integral in starting this conversation. I think she called it Orchestra X, where she reached out to a bunch of people who were not insiders, were the uninitiated who hadn't really attended orchestra concerts before. And then she sat down with them afterwards and, gave them some beer and a couple of slices of pizza and said, okay, what did you hate? And it's such an important question. Because if you don't have those conversations, you're not going to know what it is that's turning people off, what it is that people are feeling anxious about, what it is that are holding them back from purchasing tickets. So the logistics of it, it depends on your community and your organization, but it's going to have to be a project of reaching out and finding those people who are the haters, and really having those honest conversations and listening, and not just not just ignoring them and going back and doing the same old thing.
Yeah, it is and I've had Aubrey on before too, so I'm going to ruin my reputation as only being sports. I'm totally ruining it lately, because I was never really always sports, but that's besides the point. It's really important because you have to really focus on it. It has to be a priority, and if it is not, then yes, you will get the same people you always get. It's it's a tough lesson to get across. So my final question then is, so going back through all of these things, right? You use a term that I love called egocentric arts organizations. If I were the buyer and I had put on a tie as opposed to a t-shirt today, and I said, Ruth, so I want to buy into this. I want to buy into this idea, jobs to be done, market oriented. I'm gonna be better. I'm gonna keep my tie on. I'm not gonna pretend to be the customer. What would be like 3 action steps that we could do right away that people, like, no matter if they brought you, me, anybody into this organization, any organization can do just to like get started? Because I think, like, as people are starting to recover, these ideas that you're offering up and sharing are more important than ever before. They were always important. Now they even have more importance.
Yeah, I would say step number 1 is to sit down with real live people, whether they be, current loyalists or people that have never attended your events, and have these really deep conversations with them about what are their priorities in life, what do they value, what are their needs, what are the things they are trying to make progress on, and start looking for themes among these folks. And then maybe number 2 would be.
Let me add on that one. How many people? Because this is something that, like, I think people think, oh my God, it's going to take me hundreds and thousands of people. How many do you advise?
Oh gosh. I would say you definitely want more than 10, but you don't need 1,000. Sometimes it's hard because people aren't willing to have these kinds of discussions. So you may have to put some incentives out there, whether it is a gift card or a free ticket or whatever. But it has to be enough where you're starting to see some themes emerge, right?
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then as you start to understand these themes, then you have something to use in your marketing and your strategy. So step number 2 is start to tell your audiences through your website, your social media, your ads, how your offerings can help them with these jobs to be done, how your offerings can help transform their lives, transform their world. That's a complete 180 from the other, the egocentric approach of telling your readers how wonderful you are. You're going to want to start to write in everyday language. That's how you're going to build trust. You're going to display empathy by writing in the language that your customers are using. And that's why these interviews are so important, because you're going to get these incredible gems of turns of phrases that you can literally turn around and put it on your website. And people start to say, oh, that's me. That's how I feel. And that builds the trust and the empathy that you need. And it's just that, stop wasting time, money, and effort on that egocentric approach. You're gonna pull in more people when you start creating stories that they resonate with. So is that 3 steps? I think that was.
I'll allow it. So where do people find you on the internet now?
Yes, you can find more of my thoughts on customer-centric marketing and strategy for the arts at my blog, which is cultureforhire.com. I have a quiz there where you can assess your organization's level of customer centricity, if that sounds like fun. And I also have a daily curation of customer-centric arts and marketing that you can follow as well. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I thought it was great. So I'm glad I was able to finally track you.
Yeah, this was delightful, Dave. Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's been a real pleasure.
What did you think about my conversation with Ruth Hartt? Let me know by sending me an email. It is my name, Dave, at davewakeman.com. You can check out my website. It's davewakeman.com. There are classes, a store, a blog, all kinds of stuff that'll tell you how to engage with me, how to connect with me, how to find out what I'm up to. So check it out, davewakeman.com. Make sure you get the Talking Tickets newsletter. That's talkingtickets.substack.com. Or if you go to davewakeman.com, there is a drop-down box. Check out my friends at Booking Protect, the global leaders in refund protection. Like I said at the start, there is a great article coming out from Sportico through the John Wall Street newsletter where we talk about refund protection now, why it matters, why it's important, what to look for when you're working with a refund protection provider, all kinds of great things. So go to sportico.com and check out Corey Leff's newsletter. Corey, a longtime friend of the podcast, so check it out. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm planning this thing called a Podference, which is the world's very first podcast-based ticket conference, theme of recovery. I need your help, though. And I need you to click on the link that's in the show notes. Tell me what you like about what you need, what ideas you'd want, what you need to hear, all kinds of stuff. Whatever it is you need, let me know. That way I can do the best I can to not make myself fall flat on my face with the Podference, right? This is going to be great. It's the first time I know of anything like this being done in the world of tickets. I've seen it done in small businesses and B2B areas before. I think that this might be a good way to educate people in the interim as more shows get back online. People get back to work, people come back to shows and events, because I know that like some of the utility of the conferences is being dampened because people just don't have the budgets for these things. So this might be a good, cool tool. It might be fun. It might work, or I could fall completely flat on my face. Either way, there is a link in the show notes. Help me out. Let me know what you think, and we will try to make this thing work. Okay? As always, hey, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. I think the Omicron variant wave is receding, I hope. I mean, I finally am starting to feel better myself, but if you need somebody to talk to, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You know how to reach me. As always, I want to thank you so much for being here and listening, sharing the podcast, sharing the newsletter, doing all those things. I couldn't do this, or probably wouldn't do this without you. So thank you so much, and I will talk to you again soon. Take it easy.